My name is Austin Henderson. I am an artist, writer, and culture worker, usually based in Montreal. I'm currently the artist in residence here at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa, with a show opening on June 13th entitled Talking to Papou. I received my BFA in visual art from Queen's University in Kingston in 2018. And then I pursued my master's in art history at Concordia University in Montreal. I've been living in Montreal since 2018. My practice currently considers legacies around familial history, intergenerational queerness, and legacies of HIV and AIDS in Canada. I also pursue art writing for various arts publications around Canada, and I have taken up residencies in addition to the RMG here in Newfoundland, Union House Arts, as well as with MOMUS, which was online, and the New York Academy of Art in New York City. So my exhibition focuses on the relationship between myself and my maternal grandfather, who was born, raised, and lived in Oshawa his entire life. Shortly after coming out to my family in my mid-20s, I discovered and learned, rather, that my maternal grandfather passed away from AIDS-related complications in 1988. I never met my grandfather. So this exhibition engages a lot with archival materials from both my family's collections as well as some public archives to consider the relationship we could have had, the conversations we could have shared, and questions sort of legacies of secrecy, shame, but also love and reclamation through that. So the work in this exhibition encompasses painting, printmaking, photo-based works, a textile work, and really tries to paint the life of my grandfather, or Papou, which is grandfather in Greek, focusing on the joy of his life and the relationship that could have been between us. My mother's side of the family is Greek Canadian, and this was a part of my heritage that I was always very proud of growing up and still am. But there was a bit of a rupture in that heritage because both of my grandparents on that side actually passed away quite young. My yaya, or my grandmother, passed away in 1967, so I never met her. She passed away from cancer. And my Papou passing away in the late 80s meant that there was a sort of break in that passing down of knowledge that maybe would have been, for example, learning Greek or being more culturally involved in Greek community. Despite that, my mother and my aunts and my other family on that side has always really embraced their Greek heritage through cooking and through family reunions. And so it was always something, and still is something, that I'm quite proud of. And since starting this project, I've deepened that pride a bit more, learning about all the times my grandfather traveled to Greece, for example, throughout his life, learning more a bit about my family history. Although this exhibition isn't necessarily, a genealogy project or a project that focuses on simply just my family lineage, there is definitely this sort of hold on my Greek heritage with the works that are included in the exhibition, and the sort of legacies around being Greek and being queer, and thinking about those different lines and how they might intersect. I think this exhibition, for somebody who sees it for the first time, it is an exploration of my grandfather's life through different ways of looking into my family's archive. So while the exhibition on the surface is very personal, I think that there are these universal themes that will pull from it. Of course, we all have family history, and we all have family who perhaps we never met or didn't know quite well. So I think that this exhibition will allow people to maybe look a bit deeper into their family archives and consider what is left out of family collections, be it photographs or other objects, because there's so much that a photograph tells us, but there's also so much that's left out. And that is really where this exhibition sits, is that sort of unknown, and the what if, and the sort of what is excluded from the telling of a family story, and why we can look deeper into those unknowns. There's one photograph that was the point of departure for this project, I think, and it's a very simple square Polaroid of my grandfather, and he's just sitting down with his legs crossed at the kitchen table, with his hand held up to a rotary phone, speaking on the phone, and he's looking into the camera. And that very easily inspired the sort of title for this body of work, for this exhibition, Talking to Papou. I was kind of envisioning myself on the other line of the telephone having a conversation with him. And I just like, photo is he's well dressed, he's posed. It's a candid photo, obviously. It's just in my mother's kitchen growing up, but that was the starting point for this body of work, I'd say. So this project really began as an idea in, I would say, 2022, 2023, when I started having these growing questions about who my grandfather was, and specifically about the queer nature of his life, being somebody who, I don't want to necessarily say had a double life, but definitely there was a part of his life story that was unknown or underrepresented by my family. And so I started simply looking through family photos. Gratefully, my mom has a bunch of photos and objects, as well as my aunts. And so I just started parsing through hundreds and hundreds of photographs. Some of them were in scrapbooks. Some of them were photos that I grew up with in frames. And then some were just stowed away in boxes, chocolate boxes, cigar boxes, and hadn't been opened for many, many years. And that's where it started to kind of allow me to see my grandfather's life through these snapshots and through these sort of different levels of the archive, from, for example, these more prominent photos that were framed that I grew up seeing of him and my family on that side of the family, as well as, on the other side, these boxes of photographs that hadn't been opened since he passed almost 40 years ago. And so I'm thinking about the sort of, for lack of a better word, that sort of hierarchy of the sort of imperfect family archive, and how these collections are kept and managed, and how they represented his life and the life of my maternal family. There were several photographs that I discovered during this residency back in March, so shortly after it began, that really made me rethink, or rather almost reaffirm what this project was about. In one of these photo boxes that my aunt lent to me to pursue this project and make work from were over a dozen photographs of men in drag. And they were all labeled October 31st, 1954, so Halloween. Don't know who these men are. I think it's mostly just one man, so it's likely one of my grandfather's friends, but he's dressed up, ready to go to a Halloween party and posing in someone's home in Toronto. And that to me was like, okay, yep, he had queer friends. He had this sort of life before he was a father, before he was a husband. And I wanted to really explore that further. And those photos let me see my grandfather not just as this, matriarch and as my Papou and as someone who raised my mother, etc., but it let me see him as a peer, and someone who I could envision, maybe hanging out with if I were alive back then and things were different. It made me see him as an equal rather than someone who maybe would have been my elder or my superior if he were alive when I grew up. I think what draws me to exploring incomplete archives is that the fact that a lot of queer histories, a lot of trans histories, any sort of marginalized histories are not really documented in public archives because of lack of resources, because of very political choices against documenting these communities. So for me, the family archive, as sort of imperfect as it might be, lets me kind of at least pinpoint sensibilities of my Papou's life that point to his identities, be it queer, be it Greek, be it somebody who was really involved in the arts, etc. And so I think that exploring those archives in my family as the starting point, and then, kind of piecing together memories of mine and experiences that I've had, allows me to kind of sit in somewhere between truth and fiction in a way, which is something that a lot of queer folks have to do in understanding their own histories if they don't have someone who is able to pass down knowledge or an oral history to them. We rely so heavily on these sort of almost imagined and speculative histories rather than something that's in black and white and documented, because they can be really hard to find sometimes. These themes of grief and tenderness and love and joy and all these sometimes opposing feelings come together in the work through really, the curator, Hannah, who is working on this with me, has used the word devotion when it comes to my work so far. And I've been thinking about that as a sort of devotion to representing my grandfather's life in its fullness and in its complexity, revealing maybe parts of him that were unseen or kind of under-discussed in my family circle, allows me to kind of spend time with him in a way that is sort of impossible to do in any other way than to make art, I think. The paintings behind me, for example, I consider to be devotional in that they are taken from very, very small Polaroids that have literally so little detail in the photograph. And I'm choosing, paint to kind of uplift them and give them a new light and kind of take these photos that were stowed away in boxes for years to give them a bit of a new importance and a new significance. Grief comes into play in a couple of the works that touch a bit more on the sort of unknowns and the unanswered questions. So there's a series of stone lithographs that I've produced that are all letters to my Papou, and they engage mostly with some photos that I've found in archives and my own personal experiences to ask him questions. There's a bit of a melancholic nature to these letters in that they will never be answered. They will never be responded to by my grandfather. They're very much speculative and kind of just sort of holding their space with that unknown and with that lack of resolution or that lack of response. While there's so much fullness in my family's archive in the physical materials, there's also still an emptiness there that I'm sitting with and spending time with. And the work kind of hones in on that emptiness that's at some point sad, but most times I hope very joyful, and paints my grandfather's life and my family's life in a very uplifting manner. I think the biggest question I would want to ask my Papou if he were around today would probably just be wanting to know where he finds the joy in his life, and where he sort of feels most like himself. I have an idea that it might be the garden. He loved gardening, and my mom told me that he was like the first person that she knew that composted, for example, and he was involved in the Oshawa Garden Club for many years. But I think I would just want to know what made him happy, and what kind of brought him relief, brought him joy, and brought him comfort. And whatever that meant to him. It might be something so small as gardening, or maybe, listening to music, going out to the theater. I don't know. I think I just want to know what brought him joy in his life. So the point of departure for me when I'm making new work with this body of work in particular is always the family photographs. So most often I will look at a family photograph that really is interesting to me, maybe in the story that it's telling or the story it's not telling, simply because I like the composition of it, or it reminds me of a memory or an idea of my Papou that I have been told. There are a lot of photos of him, for example, working away in his garden or posing with his flower bed. So those sort of touch points of parts of his identity that I knew, and then I will take those and translate them into paintings. I believe that, taking these very small kind of, I don't want to say banal objects, but these sort of minuscule snapshots and making them into these larger pieces allows them to kind of live another life. And with paint, for example, you can manipulate, brush strokes and color as much as you would like. So that's one process. And I also will use the photos to jot down a list of questions I'd want to ask him or conversations I'd want to have with him about these photographs. And that's where the letters came into play, the series of letters to my Papou. I've also been working a lot with photo transfers in this work, which is taking the photograph and transferring it onto fabric and other materials like canvas or wood, to represent them in a new way. And so I'm working on a quilt that uses these photos pretty directly to show a rich kind of tapestry of his life in photographs that were very prominent growing up, but also these snapshots that were less so, such as men in drag and a parade in New Orleans during my grandfather's honeymoon to my yaya, So these sort of moments here that allow me to kind of put them together, collage them, and create a sort of story from one image. The residency in Oshawa has been incredibly special because, of course, I have familial roots here. My Papou was born, raised, and lived in Oshawa for all of his life. And so with that, I've been able to really lean into the local history of this project and engage with local archives in a way that I don't think would be quite as accessible if this residency were anywhere else. Simply by having, family live close by who are able to drop off old journals of his or photo boxes, letters, etc., as well as being able to go to the Oshawa Public Library next door to the RMG and go through microfilm of newspaper clippings has been super helpful. And the Oshawa Historical Society as well, getting to visit their archives earlier this spring. The Oshawa Museum Archives has an audio recording of my Papou, which is really cool. He presented a lecture on the Greek community in Oshawa in 1982, and that entire lecture is recorded. So I was able to listen to that, which was really special because I had never heard his voice before that. So yeah, there's so much, I think, locally that's really special to the RMG and to my grandfather. He was also I learned very recently, on the board of volunteer trustees to the RMG back in the late 80s, just as it was about to expand to its current building. So yeah, there's just like a very special lineage here with the RMG. I used to work here in the summer camps about 10 and 11 years ago. So it's always been an institution that's been very close to my heart and has many layers of meaning for me. I think after seeing the exhibition, my hope for visitors is that they're encouraged to look a little bit more deeply into their family history. If they ever had curiosities about a family member who they didn't know very well or never got to meet, maybe it will encourage them to dig into some photo boxes or, reach out to that relative and ask their questions. Whether or not that relative is still around, I think there's always opportunities to learn more about where we come from, but also an opportunity to consider not just what is documented, but, wonder about all the unknowns in a family. Every family has their sort of secrets or their sort of quirks, I suppose. I hope that visitors to this exhibition get to kind of consider how that relates to their family story. My family has been very gracious and very generous in the creation of this body of work. The reason for my Papou's passing was a secret for a long, long time and for relevant reasons. But I remember when I initially proposed this idea to my parents and especially to my mother, she was at first hesitant about divulging this part of his life to the public at one point or another. And then in the same phone call, she said to me, this is no longer the 1980s. He would be proud of you. And I think it's time that we kind of bring this story to light and let your grandfather's story be told in its entirety. So they've been very generous, both on the mental and emotional side, but also in just the wealth of objects that I've been lent to create this work in the last couple of years, and especially in the last few months here at the RMG. And I think it's been cathartic for them, I hope, to see their father's life be represented in this way by me, by his grandson. I hope it allows them to, love him even a little bit more, if that's possible. Yeah. This is my first solo exhibition, and it's kind of my first body of work that I've made since graduating from my undergrad in fine arts. So for me, this exhibition and this project marks a beginning for me as an emerging artist, and as someone who has been able to kind of so deeply spend time with this source material. I'm very happy to have this space, especially here, of all spaces, to show off this work to the public. And I'm really looking forward to what people have to say about the work. Working in an art gallery myself, back in Montreal, I get to work with artists so much, and I get to help them out on their journey and installing their exhibitions. And I'm really looking forward to being on the other side of that for the first time in a while. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the show and people's responses to it.